I'm Ted Edwards. I'm starting already second year in the lab, and I'm the machine learning guy. And happy to be here to talk to you all a little bit about machine learning. We're doing a little introduction today. So today is you're not going to learn a ton about machine learning because this takes a long time. But what you are going to do is I'm going to introduce some concepts and ways and directions to go, so you'll understand at least the conceptual factors behind machine learning and some of the terminology to kind of get you on the right path. As we go through this, I'll explain a lot of the things here that kind of, like I said, will get you going in the right direction. Feel free to raise your hand and ask questions. I don't mind being interrupted. If you can hold, if you think I'm going to say something, kind of wait for a second, but because I'll try to explain a lot of things, but we're not going to get too in depth, but I'm going to show you a lot about machine learning and we'll enjoy it. So let's talk about machine learning. With the outline today is we're going to talk about data because without data, there is no machine learning because you need data for the machine and your computer program to learn. We're going to talk about what actually is machine learning because that's a word that's been thrown around a lot. It's kind of a buzzword almost. It's in the industry. So if you're working in business, people throw around machine learning just to get some shareholders all happy. But we want to actually talk about it for practical uses, what we're doing for data science and biology. We're going to look at some terminology, concepts, some types, machine learning, some algorithms, and lastly, we're going to look at some applications on how machine learning can be applied. All right, so this is a slide that's a little bit old at this point, so that graph is even higher now. But right now, we are swimming in data. And about 10, 12 years ago, about 15 now actually, biology kind of moved into a data science. And genomics is one of the newest fields out there. And that field emerged because of our ability to sequence the human genome, but also the ability of computers to acquire data. And so we have so much data, and you see the title of the slide, it says data rich, information poor. So we have tons and tons and tons and tons of data, but it doesn't mean we have a lot of information from the data. So it's we need to be able to analyze the data in a way that makes sense, because just because you have a lot of data doesn't mean you have good information and good things that come from it. And so that's the kind of conundrum we're in right now. And humans were good at a lot of things, but synthesizing a lot of information in one shot is not our forte. But machines are good at that. And so with our data that we need to go into, you need to understand a couple things about data. These are the 5 V's. Normally there are 4 V's, but there's a fifth one here if you add a couple things for value. But this goes through any kind of data science. So this will work with cloud computing. A lot of businesses do that. Any data analytics, any software design. These are the V's of data, and it depends on the volume, obviously, how much data you have, the variety, the different forms, the velocity, the rate. So if you're working with something that's going into a model or into some kind of cloud algorithm, how fast the data is coming in, the value. So that can be kind of if the data is meaningful or not, and the veracity, basically if it's correct data and not bogus, right? And so that's, the garbage in, garbage out with computer programming. So those are the big V's of data. And right now, so you need to understand that with just because we have large amounts of data, like I said, we have low amounts of information, but also within that, within the data, this is the types of stuff that has to be broken down to be considered when doing machine learning. So what is machine learning? So there's a lot of text in here. We're not going to read it. You guys can look at it later. But basically, machine learning is a type of artificial intelligence. So the hierarchy is artificial intelligence, machine learning, and then we're going to get into deep learning a little bit later. But basically, it's any computer program that is mimicking human behavior in a way. That's what AI is. And machine learning is basically having a program do something without you having to explicitly program it, right? So you can easily write something, write a script, write a program to say, hey, if you find this value in a list, spit out the answer, right? But what if you have a list that you don't know it's going to generate? How do you you don't have time to program every single value coming in? How are you going to, kind of evaluate that? And that's what machine learning is. It gives us the opportunity to have a program essentially learn from data. And that's kind of what we want to do, because computers are fast. They're dumb, but they're fast. And so if we can give them the tools to be able to put things together, they can create their own tasks, and they can create their own algorithms, which we'll find to do tasks quicker for us that help us make better inferences, especially in this sense, biology, but it doesn't matter whatever field you're in, business, marketing, advertising, all that good stuff. But for us, it's for biological research, and that's important. Um, we're gonna skip on that one. So basically, a couple applications. We're just gonna blaze over these. I'll talk about them again more and later. But you guys have all seen machine learning in action. You type in the letter G in your Google search bar, and you get 17 different things. You're like, wait, Google, I didn't even think of anything. But it's based on your previous entries, right? And so every person who puts a search term in there is going to get slightly different responses based on your thing, and that's machine learning. That's NLP, actually natural language processing, that Google and other companies have instituted. Computer vision, right? Be able to analyze images, speech recognition. That's important. You can predict the kind of the stock market, right? Financial predictions. We can use that in robotics. There's a lot of different ways to do that. And that's important right now. And so now these are a lot of terms here. So I put all these on here. I'm not going to define each one of these. I'm going to go over a couple of these right now, but these are just some of the terms that are very, very, very important to machine learning, right? And these are the concepts that I was going to mention that, hey, we're not going to go super deep. You're not going to learn everything today, but you are going to get a good taste. And hopefully it's to stimulate some interest. So you're like, wow, this is really cool, which is kind of where I went. A few years back when I discovered machine learning, I thought it was the coolest thing ever. So that's kind of like what I really like. So obviously an algorithm, right? That's the series of steps in order to do a task, right? And so an algorithm generally it doesn't have to be mathematical, but an algorithm basically is a recipe, right? But in our sense, it's a mathematical equation that can apply weights or functions to just predict an output, right? That's what we want. If you need to understand, we're going to talk about classification, regression, activation functions, features, all these different things that are important. Neural networks, these are all important. So I suggest that when you have some time, take a minute or two, look up some machine learning terminology and kind of see what they do. But as we go through osmosis, you'll get a lot of these terms that I'll kind of define for you. I put this in here again because today we're working with machine learning because this is our R seminar, so we're doing R. But a lot of machine learning is done with Python and a specific library. So I put this in there just basically for reference. So again, I'm not going to go over this, but again, I wanted everyone to have a good understanding of what machine learning was and what are the reasons that we can use it in different tools, right? And so right now, since we're focusing on R, I'm not going to go deep in these, but these are also all important. Burhan will recognize these slides. So these are Pandas, MATLAB, Matplotlib, sklearn. These are very awesome built-in libraries for Python that can help you do machine learning projects. So, but you can also use R within those packages too, which is really pretty cool. All right, so now the important stuff. Let's talk about machine learning itself, right? What are the types of machine learning? And so I haven't really described what machine learning does yet, but you'll understand through understanding the types. It's kind of like put your hands on and do it first, right? So first of all, we have two main types, supervised and unsupervised learning. We have a couple other ones, semi-supervised and reinforcement, that we'll hit a little bit, but basically the two you need to understand is supervised learning and unsupervised learning. Supervised learning means that we have the data labels, we have the answers to the test. So it's like, you remember in high school math, where you go in the math, you try a math problem and you didn't understand the answers in the back of the book, you can do that. Or another example is, hey, I have a list of things. If you're checking the typical machine learning teaching tool is the email spam conundrum, right? It's like, oh, is this email spam or not spam? You label all these emails spam or not spam, and you feed it to a computer program that it learns that, okay, that is spam and not spam. That is spam and not spam. So we can look at the features or the characteristics of an email and say, okay, here's a characteristic this email has. It is labeled as spam. Okay, that is what spam looks like. So if you do that enough time, it understands that. So the thing, it has the labels. So the result is the label. That is what you heard the word label a lot. So the label is if it's spam or not. And supervised learning gives the answers to the machine learning algorithm, and then it compares the features of whatever the answers are and it spits out an example. So if you're classifying images, you have a bunch of images of cats and dogs, you first feed your machine learning algorithm a bunch of images of cats and dogs that are labeled. You're like, this one's cat, this one's dog, this one's cat, this one's dog. Then you feed it some images that don't have labels, it's been trained, it can learn from its previous labels to predict, right? That's the key here. You can predict based on the labels. That's supervised learning. Unsupervised learning means the data is not labeled. So you have a giant, we can go back um, to the cat and dog example. Let's say you have a lot of images and you don't know what the labels are. You feed it to the algorithm, and the algorithm is going to be like, hey, I'm going to look at the features that are in these images that kind of group them together. It's going to see like, pointy ears, smaller face, smaller body size, different color patterns, and it's going to say, okay, those are generally in this thing. It's not going to necessarily label them cat or dog, but it's going to say these are the features, and it's going to say, oh, this one has, larger, longer snouts, different things, and it's going to kind of group these things together, and that's going to be it's going to give you a grouping of it. And it doesn't necessarily know the labels. It's going to give you a percentage based on that. And so that's unsupervised learning because it doesn't know what they are, but it's just going to group your data based on similar characteristics or features, right? So in supervised learning, we have a couple things that we do, different algorithms. There's basically classification. You can classify, like I mentioned, spam or not spam, and you have regression, and that's basically on any continuous variable, so numerical values. So classification you use for discrete variables, and regression you use for continuous variables. So if you guys know the difference between discrete, that's different categories, right? You have dog, cat, and regression in continuous variable is like a range of numbers. So a housing prices, right? So if you have the prices of houses, you can estimate the actual number within a range, right? That's where you use regression. But those are the types of supervising learning models. You heard the word clustering a lot because clustering, like I mentioned, it's grouping. So you'll have a lot of data points. It'll cluster the data together. That's what unsupervised learning algorithm is. Okay. So if you have a cluster, your data will be analyzed and chunked into clusters based on its features that are similar. And that's kind of what supervised and unsupervised learning is. Any questions before we go any farther? Because that is the biggest thing here, just understanding the difference between supervised and unsupervised learning. Feel free to shout it out, raise your hand in the chat. Don't mind. Good to go? Cool. All right, so this is a kind of another way just to kind of visualize the machine learning. It kind of shows what you can do. This is a fun visualization of it. I kind of liked it. You can see here classification and regression, right? And it gives you examples of how it's done, right? Of different examples. And you have clustering, okay? And those are the different deals. So you guys take a look at that later, but that's important. So knowing that unsupervised learning is clustering, supervised learning is classification. So we're going to look here. So here's a good example. So you have a training algorithm here, supervised learning. So you have what things are. This can classify them, right? I'm just gonna put it all out together. So basically, you have the learning model, right? You want to find all the triangles, right? Hey, triangles are one, negative ones are not triangles, right? So then you put something into your algorithm, and it's gonna say, hey, is it a triangle or not? The funny thing is here, it's showing a heart. Is it a triangle or not? But basically, that's a supervised learning because you feed your algorithm, you train it to learn what triangles are, right? And then if it's not a triangle, it's not a triangle. And so that's how it learns. Here, you give it a bunch of shapes, and then it's going to classify them based on their characteristics. So you can see these all have 3 sides. These are all round. These are all have 4 sides. So it clustered them. It doesn't know what a triangle is. Your machine, it doesn't know. You have to tell it, but it doesn't know what a triangle. It doesn't know what an ellipse is or a circle is. It doesn't know what a trapezoid or a square is, like a parallelogram. It doesn't know that. But what it does know, it can look at the features or characteristics of the data you put into it and group them and cluster them. And that's what unsupervised learning is. So when you're doing exploratory data analysis or EDA, you can use clustering to help you find some patterns in your data to give you a place where to start. That's a good thing to do. If you do know your labels, and you know what you're trying to find, and you know the data is labeled, then you can use supervised learning to make good predictions if your model is good. And so that's the cool thing about supervised and unsupervised learning, to know they're used in different cases, right? And they can tell you different things. This is another example of just kind of how things work here. Just your model is just basically the workflow. You'll hear a lot of the word feature, and a feature is basically a characteristic, or it's your X value. So it's basically what you're putting in to the model in order for it to look at. So you can have as many features as you like, it doesn't really matter, depending on your computational power of the machine you're using, of your server, whatever you're using. So for me, let's say we're looking at, I mentioned again, we have labels of spam, right? And if you have certain features such as text too big, or text size would be a feature, length of email, recognized email address. So these would be, that'd be three features, or three features, or three feature vectors, right? Those are the three X values you're putting in that depend, or that are the independent variables, and your ending prediction, which is your label, will be based on those features, right? And so you hear the word feature a lot in machine learning. That is what we use, features. Feature is basically a characteristic or your X value in prediction. So the end result of machine learning is you want to predict a value based on features and data that you put into your model. And that's what we're looking at. So features, so when I say the word features, that's what I'm talking about. So how do models work? How does machine learning work? You have to train and test your model. That's it. So depending on what algorithm you're using, depending on what type of machine learning um, you're using, supervised, unsupervised, semi-supervised, you have to train your algorithm and you have to train your model and test it. So you hear the word model a lot, right? Model is basically the final product of the training session of your machine learning. It's basically the algorithm that is generated after you train your model, and it's your final model. It's your machine learning tool. It's the thing you use, right? So when we say we're training a model, we're training, inside the model is your algorithm, what works. So your machine learning model is basically your program. It's what it does. So when we say, hey, let's enhance the model, or these models, that's what we're talking about. So that's what a machine learning model is. So basically, you want to train your model and you have to test it. And so training your model involves giving it data, whatever kind of data is necessary to train the model. So if I'm training a model to um, analyze and do categorical definition of spam emails, am I going to give it a bunch of demographic data of people? No, you have to give the model what you need, what it needs to have, right? So it doesn't make sense to give it random information. So basically, you train your model on data that needs to be trained with. All right. Then you have testing, right? You need to use data that the model has never seen to be able to test it, right? Because if you do give it something that it's seen, you don't know if it's actually just cheating and using previous results, or if it's actually has learned. So you have to give it data that it's never seen to be able to generalize a prediction. So basically, when you have data, you have a large set, and you want to take your data and you want to subset your data into a training set and a testing set. So as you can see here, it says the training set is observed. The model can see the training set, obviously, right? It knows how much, it knows what the character, oops, it knows what the characteristics are of the data. It knows where it is. It knows how much. It's seen the data. Your testing data set, you hold to the side and don't let your model see it. So then once you have created a model and tested it enough and your algorithms have been generated, you got to see, okay, I think this model is ready to go. Let's test it and see how well it does. And then we'll look at different performance metrics on how to be able to test it using error values, accuracy, root mean squared error, all these different things that we can use. But basically, you need to be able to see, hey, model, how well are you, right? And so if you look at this one, this is basically a supervised learning model, because you can see it has all the answers. It's getting it perfectly 100% right here. It's got all separated, all the blue X's here on the left and the red circles on the right, because it's seen the data. It's like, okay, it's learning, right? And now you feed it random data, and this is how well it does. You can see it does pretty well. It's got a few X's. It's got mostly blue X's over here. It's got mostly red over here. It's got a few mistakes, but in general, it's doing pretty well, you would say. So this is why you give it unobserved data, to see how well it can predict, because obviously we can't predict anything 100%. Our goal is to get as close to that as possible, but you're never going to be 100%. We want our models to basically be able to predict as close to 100% and have the least amount of error as possible. When you're doing your data, this is kind of getting really deep in the weeds. We're not going to go crazy here, but you want to be able to do to segment your data when you train and test it. So there's a thing called cross validation. It's when you take data and you segment it out. So first of all, let's say you have a training set that's relatively small, or you have so you don't have a lot of data. You have maybe 100 samples, right? You could do something called K cross validation, which breaks your 100 samples into 5 pieces, so 5 sets of 20, and you random sets of 20, right? And you train it on 80 sample, or you train on 80 samples and you test it on 20. Then you rotate your samples and you do another 20. And so you take each one of those 5 segments and you hold one out for testing and hold one out and do the other 4 for training. That's kind of what cross validation is. So you can see here, this one has been segmented into 3. So it takes these 2, it trains on the 2, and it tests on the 3rd, and then it rotates it. That's cross validation. That allows you to have the most robust training to be able, so you can see if your model is just learning the data or it's actually be able to generalize and see, hey, is this model working? Because when the model learns the data, it's called overfitting, which we'll talk about in a second. And so we need to be able to assess the performance of our models in machine learning. And once we have been able to create a model, we have to be able to see what works, right? And there are different types of ways to assess model performance. For regression, and so we talked about classification and regression. These are the main things we use: the mean absolute error, the mean squared error. And I've highlighted 2 here because these are the most important: the adjusted R squared and the root mean R squared. These are the ones, and these are their equations here. These are what we used. And basically, I'll break this down as you can see it. So the error, if you know it, so there's 4 letters here: root, mean, squared, error, right? The error rate is just the difference between your y and see the y hat. That's your prediction, right? So that's basically how far off you are from prediction. So if I predict that you're at a store, you're gonna sell 100 units this week, and you sell 97, right? I subtract the actual value, 97, right? You subtract the actual minus 100, and my error is 3, right? That's your error. Then the squared error, SE, is your square. You take the square of that, right? Because that amplifies how far the error is, and this is a way mathematically we can use to pinpoint error more, and also takes the sign away. Then you have the sum of the error. You can see the summation there, and then the mean, you see the n. So you take the mean squared error. So that's what this is. Within this is the root mean squared error, and the reason why we do that is because it puts the value of the error inside the same units as the value that you're predicting, right? So like the squared error, if I say, here's your squared error, it's 3.2% or whatever, that's okay, that's great. But when you do the root mean squared error, that's in the same units as whatever you're calculating. So if I'm calculating housing prices, right? The root mean squared error will show you how far off in the actual units of housing prices, or in the height of your tomato plants in your yard, so whatever it is. So that's what the root mean squared error is, and you can see that. So it's very important. The adjusted R squared, that's also a very good thing here. We want to be able, that's basically your variance, and that shows you how far off. And the adjusted R squared adds a penalty factor in, so it's more accurate, and that's what we really want here. So in this equation, it looks crazy, but it's not. K is basically the number of samples you have, the number of features you have, excuse me, and N is the number of samples. So it's just basically the R squared with a value adding to with the number of features that you use, because the more features you use, right, the more accurate it'll be. So this adds that in there. So here it is again. Here, this is a good slide for you to understand. Here, I put this in here because it's important. So basically, we use this when you have a lot of variables that add to it. You want a higher value, right? Because it's almost like a correlation coefficient, right? The R squared, and that's kind of what we're looking at. We want it to be higher. The higher the R squared, the better it predicts, and the more closely related they are, right? And here's the root mean squared error again. For classification, we have different performance metrics. We have accuracy, precision and recall, and the AU and the ROC. So basically, accuracy is basically how many you got right over the total number of predictions, right? That's just how accurate you are. And we use that a lot for certain things. And so is everybody familiar with accuracy or precision recall? Yes, no? We good there? We're going to talk a little bit about it here in a second. So you guys have seen these before. Basically, you have the ground truth and your predictions here. So you can, this is a confusion matrix. You can You can flip these any way you want. You can do truth. It doesn't matter, but um, as long as the boxes line up, it doesn't matter. So basically, it's saying, hey, this is what's the ground truth. So how many, and this is your prediction, right? So you have a test here, where this for us would be our prediction of our algorithm. So the actual case is confirm this person has cancer. The test predicts it's cancer, so that's a true positive, right? The test or the truth is the person has cancer, but the test says negative. That's a false negative, right? So the same thing. Test the truth is it's negative. The test says it's positive. That's a false positive, right? And so that's how you go. So when you're calculating a couple things, that's sensitivity is true positives divided by the true positives plus false negatives. So these are the different things you need to learn to understand what's going on here for some performance metrics. So that's why if you go back to here, your true positives plus your true negatives, which means everything you got right, divided by every single prediction possible. So that's your accuracy. And the reason why we talk about that is because we have the ROC, and this is a good curve. This is built into a lot of models, a lot of functions here. And so an ROC of 1 means you got to do the perfect job. So the reason why I showed you this slide here is just so you can understand what it actually is plotting here, because it's a plot of the true positive rate, how against the false positive rate, 1 minus the specificity. So that's what we were trying to. That's the plot here: the true positive, the false positive rate, right? And it creates a curve. So if you get a perfect score, right, everything's perfect. A value is 1, right? So as your model is predicting, you want it to look like this, right? Because then you look at the area under the curve, the AUC. This area using calculus, but we don't have to calculate. You can do that. You can derive that, and you can do an integral if you like, or you can use a computer program. The area under this curve is what your score is, right? So the closer to 1 it is, the better. And that's what we're looking at here. So obviously, if you look at this 45-degree line, that's just basically a guess, right? Because that means it's 50% above, 50% below. That's just as good as just taking a random guess, right? And so this is an okay model. It's probably like AOC is 0.6 or whatever. But you get up to hit this range, you're getting to 0.8, 0.9. This is very good. This is what you want here, the area under the curve. So you want your model when you plot the AUC to look like this. This is the sweet spot. So if your model is doing this, then you know you're on the right path, right? If it's starting to do this, you have some improvements to do. You're like, okay, I'm doing good. But once you're here, you're solid. So now we're going to move into the next wave of machine learning, which is called deep learning. And deep learning is machine learning, but it's basically creating multiple layers, hence deep, that can process data. And so we're basically taking a machine learning model and layering it with multiple algorithms, multiple layers of activation functions and algorithms to create a better and better model, right? So you feed it to one layer, it processes the data and analyzes it, then feeds it to another one, so it gets better and better and better and better and better. And that's what we're looking at deep learning. And basically, deep learning is kind of we're getting to that uses networks and neural networks, which is we're basically kind of molded to mimic how us animals, our brains work, because we have neural networks in our head. So we kind of wanted to map them after that. And so that's what neural networks are. They're basically trying to mimic that. They stem from ANNs, which are artificial neural networks, which again are inspired by like animal brains, not humans, but animal brains. And so that's what deep learning is. And so there's a couple types of neural networks here. You have feed-forward neural networks, and you have multi-layer percepticons. So you don't have to learn these necessary tools, but you need to learn that each one of these is this is a neural network. You need to know that each one of these is a node, and see this is a layer, and here's the end of your deal. So this is where you put your data in here on the left side. You see in the figure at the bottom, and it goes through this neural network, and it's predicted at the end, right? Because what are we trying to do with machine learning? We're trying to predict, right? And each one of these nodes does a computational process, or has an algorithm, or has a function that creates a better and better result. And eventually we want to be able to classify whatever it is. Okay, this is a neural network, right? And this is what a different type of machine learning. So basically you have regression models, you have tons of different types of machine learning models, but this is what deep learning neural networks are in sense. And so when you got to artificial neural networks, there's a couple of kinds. Um, most neural networks use these type of things. So we're going to talk about a CNN, an RNN, which is recurrent neural network, and what they do differently. So convolutional neural networks, basically, when you see CNN, think, not the news company, think of a image processing. So that's what CNNs are for today. I mean, you can do a billion other things with them, but CNNs process images. That's what they do great at. Okay, they're really, really good at that. So they, well, the reason why they're called convolutional neural networks is because they use a small thing called the kernel and convolve, right? That's basically wrapping over an image, convolve over a matrix, a set of data, right? And an image technically is a set of pixels, right, with a value. So that's essentially a matrix, right? So that's what happens. So here is basically the structure of a convolutional neural network. You have your image, right? And you see this little small thing, which is called the kernel. Your input is your image. And here's your first layer of the neural network. So you see the LU, that's an activation function. Don't worry about that. You have your convolving layer. You have a pooling layer, which summarizes the data. Then you put it into another convolving layer, then pull it again, another convolve. You go as many layers as you can to get the best accurate prediction. Then you have, once you have your data, scaled to a right point at the end of the model, it can then go through the fully connected layer and output what the image is. And that's what we're kind of doing here. And that's where you classify it at the end. That's what a convolutional neural network does. And so if you look here, there's just this little GIF here of how it actually works. It convolves across just like this, and it spits out. It uses dot matrix products to spit out the feature. So that's basically what happens. Okay, so this kernel, you can set this kernel size whatever you want depending on what your data is on images. So this is how image processing works. So this will be a bunch of pixels, right, with values, and it makes another convolutional layer and it spits it out. So if you spread it out, right, because if you look at image processing, what do we have? RGB, red, green, blue, right? So it basically takes the red values, the green values, and it analyzes them, and it has those pixel values, right? And it can spit out what it does, and you get an output on that's what that part of the image is. And so this is basically how an image convolutional neural network works. So and the thing is cool, you can set your kernel size. A 3x3 is pretty typical. 2x2 is typical. And so that's how it works. And then it takes these values that it gets from this, adds them all up, and then it puts it into your final output. And then you can use this output to analyze data at the end to spit it out. And that's what a CNN does. So when you put it all together, it looks like this. And there's a couple ways to do the pooling. You don't really need to know that. You can max pool, which basically says, hey, if you're doing a 2x2, you can take the max number here, which would be 9 right there, the max 7 there, the max of here is 8. That's max pooling. Or you can do average pooling, which just takes the average of all these numbers and puts it there. So there's different kind of ways. Not too crazy, just some interesting ways. So here's a cool thing that works. This is an old LNet is like one of the first neural networks that recognizes text and numbers, and so it's basically just doing a continuous neural network. You can see how right when the 3 goes over the 5, it doesn't quite know what it is, but basically it can tell you the numbers because it's using a neural network. And here are the different features how it breaks it down. So these are the different layers, how it sees each one slightly different, so then it can predict. And so here's another layer. So eventually you can see how crazy this data is, how granular it can get, right? It starts here, it breaks down to here, and it breaks down to the third layer, and eventually it makes a prediction. And so that's kind of how neural networks work with CNNs. Lastly, here you have recurrent neural networks, or RNNs. These are, just when you hear RNN, these are text. So when you have text analyzing, it's recurrent neural networks. They're awesome at that. This is what they excel in. If you're going to use any kind of text-to-speech, natural language processing, you want to use an RNN. You don't want to waste. You could use a CNN technically if you wanted, but that would just be a waste of resources because RNNs, they work. There's a couple of drawbacks though, is they can't really handle sequential data. So like they don't really memorize things very well, but there's other ways that we've actually kind of fixed that. But overall, these work rad. And so how recurrent neural networks work is so you know the word recurring, right? In or recursion in programming, it's going back and feeding back. So what they do is you put your input in, and each layer analyzes it, and they recur back to the previous layer and take the data from this one and redo it, and then put it back through. So each layer recurs itself and gives better and better predictions. So here's your model. Just a little quick, and then here's your hidden layers, right? Because we're in deep learning now, right? So basically what happens is you put your X in, and then each one, it recurs. It keeps itself, it keeps learning from itself. And so how does that work for text, right? So this is a recursive neural network. It just goes back and then once it hits a value, then it spits it out. So how does that work? So there's a thing called back propagation. But if you're doing a text text to speech, right? So if you're using your iPhone, right? You type in some what, it's gonna give you some suggestions at the bottom, right? And you're like, how does it know that? Well, it's learned that hey, sequentially, when you do what and you type time, right? You can see that what is weighted with all the dark here, and if you type in time, now what is only half of it, and time is that. So that neuron has recursed and been like, okay, so now I've updated the weight for what the next verb or what the next word letter is going to be. So now I can predict is it, right? So now I can predict it by basing it. So it weights each word. And that's what recurrent neural networks do is they go back, they recurse, they update the neurons, and that's how text to speech works, and that's how predictive text works. Advantages, right? It's very good at image capture of captioning because it can so it can caption like whatever images are out there. Time series prediction problems, like because it can use like previous data and predict it back out. Natural language processing, like I said. The disadvantages are like eventually, if you go back here, if you look towards the end here, the word what is very, very lowly weighted towards the end of it. So it's called a disappearing gradient. So if you had a word or an input that's very, very important, but it's in the beginning of your input, then it can be kind of lost over time. But we have ways to fix that. So yeah. Lastly, we have support vector machines. This is basically splitting your data into two, and this is good for classification. And so we have, if you have a set of data and you want to split it or segment it or classify it, this is a great way to do it. Basically, the formal definition, it creates a hyperplane or set of hyperplanes in infinite dimensional space, right? Us mere humans, we can only think in really 3 dimensions, right? I mean, we know there's 4 if you consider space-time, but we can only think in 4. So if I asked you, hey, think of a 5-dimensional ball, you'd be like, what? Right? But computers can think in technically infinite dimensions, right? So it doesn't matter for them, but they can segment and categorize data in different dimensions and be able to separate our data out when we have large, vast amounts of data. So basically, a support vector machine, it creates a line through the data, and it wants to maximize the distance between the 2 different sets of data. Okay, so if it put a line here and then put it kind of close to the blue, it would be far away from the red, but it'd still be too close to the blue. So that wouldn't be the optimal hyperplane, right? You want to have the best spot possible, right? So if you're creating lines here, we have a little deal here, right? And so which one of these would be the best line? Anybody in the chat? This is, I think my group knows the answers to these. We've done these before. If I'm splitting this data, which is the best? Jordan says B. Anybody else? B. Yeah, B, right? That makes sense, right? That's yeah, exactly. You guys are on point. Yeah, B. B's what's up. B is the answer, right? Because you want to be able to split the data. Okay, we're gonna go to another one here. Which one is the best line here for this support vector machine? Anybody? Yeah. You guys got it. You guys are cool. You guys got it. C. All right, A, B, or C. Here's a little trick. It's getting trickier. Excuse me, A or B here. Yeah, see, we got the question marks. A, all right. Yep. The answer is A, exactly, because you want to be able to split the data. Even though there's an outlier way over here, you want to be able to split the data with as far as data points. Why? Because we have the data points labeled, and we understand that, right? All right, here's the last one. How do you do this one? Where's the line? Where do you put the line here? Yeah. Here's where it gets crazy, right? You put it on the x-axis. Yeah, not quite. So how we deal with this, right? Because again, we're looking at this in two-dimensional space. Right, so we can't see this, but you got to remember that we're probably using more than one feature, right? Remember, features or x values to predict it. So if we're just doing right now, we have one feature visible here, right? One, we just an x, and we're predicting a y, right? That's what's happening here. We only have this is only two dimensions, right? But let's say we have, let's say this is height versus weight. What if we have height and age to predict weight? So you would have a three-dimensional graph, right? So we can, what we do is called feature engineering, and we can make something else. So let's say we can make a new axis, make a z, basically making square, because we can do it anything. So you can square the x, square the y, and make a z one, right? And then a new feature called volume, right? Now we have another feature that we're using to test it. And now we can see, now how do we split it? Easy, right? Because now we have a z-axis, right? And we can see the data super, super easy, all right? It's right there, right? Because we've now, based on the z, you're like, oh, there's our data split. But that's still the same data as this. It's just visualized with a different feature, right? So when we look at support vector machines in different hyperplanes, so that's what this would be, right? The same as the bottom here. And same as this, we're like, wait, what do we do here? We create it. We basically made it in three dimensionals, and now we made another plane three-dimensionally. You see that? That's basically what just happened. So when you visualize that, that will look like this. So that's what a support vector machine is. It basically just separates your categorical data using hyperplanes. And you can do that by, you got to make sure that you have the correct features, the number of features, because again, we can't think in just simply two dimensions. Now we can do this if we do a thing called PCA, which is dimensionality reduction, but we're not going to get into that right now. But this is exactly what we're trying to do. Okay. So we're getting towards the end here. In bioinformatics and genomics, we're trying to pull this all together. We have a lot of data, right? And we want to find mutations. We want to find effects of disease. And this is a huge difficulty for us because, as you know, the human genome has 3 billion base pairs, right? It's just a large amount of data. And there's things, alternative splicing. We have genes, we have proteins with, thousands of amino acids and gene sequences, and they're all different. And so we have thousands and thousands of features and tons of data. And then that's within a single cell line. And then you can extrapolate that to a human, which there are billions of us. Your data is crazy. So we need to find how to do this. So for these, if you're pinpointing a disease, every person's going to be slightly different. Some are hereditary, some have phylogenetic differences. So we want to be able to analyze data. And so just observing alterations is not the way to do it. We need machine learning to do that. And so that's what we're kind of getting at here. And so the last two things I want to talk about real quickly is random forests, which are basically decision trees. It's basically if you ever played a choose your own adventure book, it's like do you go down the left fork or the right fork? Okay, cool. To the right fork or the left fork. It's continuous forking, right? You fork it. So the top is like, hey, is it a typical example we use is it going to rain today? Well, there's a couple predictors. Is it humid out? Yes or no? And then if it's humid, yes, it's going to rain. And if it's no, it's not humid. Well, did it rain yesterday? Yes or no? There's another one. There's another question you asked. These are binary choices. It did rain yesterday. Yes. So then the likelihood is, did it rain? Yes. So that's how you do decision trees. It's basically you use forests, you use decision trees, and you average out all their decisions to make a classification, right? It's basically simple binary choices based on your features, right? So if we had features, like I said, height, weight, and age, we could say, is this person, it's like the first choice could be age over 50. Yes, then, high rate of cancer or whatever. Or is age under, is age over 50? No, then you go to the next thing. Okay, is BMI over 30? Yes, then high rate of diabetes. And no, okay, the next thing is sugar intake above whatever. We have different metrics, right? And that'll be each one of your features, right? And that's what a random forest does. So lastly, we have for us, like I mentioned, it's a really important. We have all these different things we can use. We have protein that in our lab we use a lot of a program called Foldex, which does a lot of computational modeling, and there's a lot of machine learning that can be used to for the inputs there. We can do anything next generation sequencing, variant calling, which is basically annotating variances, explaining an SNP or an insertion deletion, whatever it is, and categorizing it. We can use all this for our biology, which is important because the vast amount of genetic disorders out there, diseases are very, very, very complicated. And in any way, any tool that we can use to help us analyze that data is important. And machine learning is now becoming more and more prevalent, and we're starting to understand it more, and it's helping us do that. So in conclusion, let's say here, we know there's a couple types of machine learning. So if you just take away from that, supervised and unsupervised, if you know the difference. So for supervised learning, we use classification and regression, right? Classification for discrete values, regression for continuous. And in unsupervised learning, clustering is a good type of modeling, right? To find the patterns in the data without labels, right? You can use CNNs and RNNs, they're deep neural networks, right? For image processing and natural language processing. Support vector machines and random forests are good for classification, right? And we can use machine learning in different things of genes like bioinformatics, in genetics and biology like bioinformatics and computational biology to help us be able to predict outcomes with data that we collect from labs experiments. Any questions?